The knocking wasn't loud. That's the first thing you need to understand. It wasn't fists on wood, it was fingernails. Slow. Deliberate. Like someone counting out a rhythm they'd practiced in their head 100 times before they finally worked up the nerve to do it for real. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. I opened the door expecting Denny Ruiz from 2 houses down, probably drunk, probably here to ask again if he could fill a few jugs from the well. It wasn't Denny. A woman stood on my porch in a hospital gown, barefoot. Her lips cracked open in a way that looked less like chapping and more like her skin had just given up. Her eyes found mine, and underneath them something was moving, like her pupils couldn't decide what size to be. "Water," she said. Just that one word. Her voice sounded like sand pouring through a funnel. I told her to wait. I told her I'd get her a glass. When I came back, she was gone. Not gone like she'd left, gone like she'd moved without me hearing it, and now she was standing at the edge of my porch light, facing the tree line where my property backs into scrub brush and mesquite. Just facing it. Water dripped off my hand onto the boards because my hand was shaking, and I didn't even know it yet. "Ma'am." She turned her head toward me too slow, like her neck had forgotten the speed a neck is supposed to move at. The porch light caught the side of her face, and that's when I saw it. Not a scratch. A bite. Human teeth, torn skin, dried black around the edges like it had happened hours ago and nobody had cleaned it, nobody had taken her to a hospital, nobody had done anything at all. I shut the door. I locked it. Through the little window, I watched her stand in my yard for 11 minutes. I counted, because counting was the only thing keeping my hands from shaking apart, and then she walked off into the brush, slow and uneven, like a woman wading through water that wasn't there. That was the start of it. Before I tell you what came after, you should know where I was standing when it happened, and why. My name is Marcus Whitfield. I was 34 that night, living alone in the house my father left me on the edge of Cedar Hollow, Texas, half a mile from the Whitfield well, the one my great-grandfather dug by hand in 1938, the one that still ran clean and full when every other well in the county had gone dry or gone brown. People used to joke that our family had a deal with God about that well. Nobody was joking anymore. Not since the drought hit hard in May. It was 11:52 on a Tuesday in late July, and outside my window the town was in its 61st day without real rain. The county kept a sign on Route 12 that updated the number every morning, like a countdown to something nobody wanted to name. I want you to know that when I opened the door, I thought she was just another person from town who'd heard about the well and walked out here dehydrated and confused. I didn't think about the news segment I'd half-watched 3 days earlier, some containment breach 2 counties over. Why would I? Cedar Hollow has a population of 2,140, a Dollar General, and 1 blinking traffic light. Things that happen in cities don't happen here. That's what I told myself, walking to the kitchen for a glass of water that never got used. I called my sister that night. Denise. 40 minutes away in Abilene with her husband Roy and their boy Caleb, 7 years old that summer and obsessed with dinosaurs the specific way 7-year-olds get obsessed with one thing until it becomes their whole personality. She didn't answer. Midnight, I told myself. People sleep at midnight. I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with every light in the house on and watched the clock crawl from 12 to 1 to 2. And around 2:40 I heard the first siren, far off toward the middle of town. By 3 there were 4 different pitches crossing each other, and under all of it, so quiet I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. Dogs. Not barking. Howling. Every dog in Cedar Hollow at once, like they'd all agreed on something the rest of us hadn't been told yet. I turned on 98.3, the station that plays classic country and reads the school lunch menu on Fridays. Static. Not dead air, static with something underneath it, a voice trying to push through that I couldn't shape into words no matter how hard I listened. At 4:15 my phone rang. Marcus. Denny's breathing came through before his words did. Fast, catching on itself. Marcus, you gotta come get me, man. There's people in the street, they're not right. Sherry didn't make it. I had to leave her. I had to leave her in the house. Marcus. Oh God, I had to leave her. Sherry was his wife. 26 years married. I'd stood at their anniversary party the summer before and watched Denny cry giving a toast about how she was the only good decision he ever made sober. "Where are you?" My voice came out steadier than I felt, and I think that's the only reason he could answer at all. "Behind the Dollar General. In the drainage ditch. There's water in it, sprinkler runoff or something, and they keep stopping at it, Marcus, like they're thirsty. Like they're so goddamn thirsty even though Sherry wasn't thirsty anymore when she." He didn't finish. I didn't make him. "Stay low. Stay quiet. I'm coming." I got my dad's old truck out of the garage. I got the shotgun down from the closet, hadn't touched it since he died 4 years earlier, and I loaded it with hands that felt like they belonged to somebody else. I wasn't brave in that moment. I was just moving. There's a difference between courage and momentum, and I didn't have the first one. I just had enough of the second to get me out the door. Cedar Hollow at 4:30 in the morning looked like a town that had been evacuated on an ordinary Tuesday and then filled back up with something else entirely. Porch lights burning in driveways with no cars in them. A kid's bicycle lying in the middle of Main Street like it had been dropped mid-ride. Figures scattered across yards and sidewalks, not moving toward anything, not moving away from anything, just standing the way that woman had stood at my tree-lean, facing whatever direction their heads happened to be pointed when whatever was left of them stopped deciding things. I passed the Baptist church. The marquee still had this week's sermon title up, something about drought and faith and waiting on the Lord, and underneath it someone had started to change the letters and only gotten halfway. "Pray for our." The rest of rain scattered on the ground where the letters had fallen or been knocked loose. I found Denny curled against the concrete wall of the drainage ditch, and 15 feet from him, 3 of them were bent at the edge of a runoff puddle, drinking. Faces in the water like animals at a trough, and every few seconds one would lift its head and make a low, wet clicking sound before putting its face back down. Whatever had happened to the rest of them, thirst was still in there. The most basic thing a body needs, the thing that had been killing this town slow for 2 months before any of this started. It was still working, still driving them, even after everything else had stopped. I got Denny into the truck bed while they drank and pulled away with a math problem building itself in the back of my mind that I didn't want to solve yet. Cedar Hollow had one well that still ran clean while every other water source in 60 miles had gone dry or gone bad. My well. And now I was watching whatever these things had become organize themselves, however blindly, around the smell and sound and memory of water. Denny didn't talk much on the drive. He just kept saying Sherry's name, low, like a habit his mouth hadn't caught up to breaking yet. Back at my place I got him water from my own tap, real water, cold and clean, and he held the glass in both hands and stared at it like he'd forgotten what it was supposed to do. "I don't know how long we're gonna have this," he said finally. "The water. I don't know how long before people know." I didn't know either. That was the truth. By 6 the sun was fully up and the heat was already pressing down like it always did, like the world hadn't gotten the memo that something had changed overnight. I stood on the porch with a shotgun across my knees, Denny finally asleep on the couch, and I watched the tree-lean where that woman had stood, and I thought about the well behind my house, the only thing in 60 miles that hadn't gone wrong. Then, way off toward the county road, I saw the first car since sunrise. Moving slow. Stopping. Starting again. Something told me, standing there in the gray light, that whoever was out there looking for something was going to find it right here. It was Earl Bannister. 71, retired from the water department 30 years back. The kind of man who knew every pipe and valve in this county like it was a map of his own hands. He'd taught me to fish when I was 9, the year my mother left, back when my dad didn't know what to do with a boy who cried too much and Earl had stepped in without ever making a thing of it. He pulled into my driveway with his hands already up. "Marcus. Easy now. It's just me." I lowered the gun. I'd learned something about myself overnight. I didn't trust anybody moving with purpose anymore, because purpose meant a person still had somewhere they needed to be, and that morning, purpose was rare. "The clinic's overrun," he said. Patients and staff both turned. Sheriff's departments barricaded from the inside. 2 deputies still alive as far as I could tell, shouting through a boarded window that they're low on water and lower on ammunition. Piggly Wiggly got broken into after 3, not looters exactly. More like people went there on instinct, on habit, looking for water in a building that used to reliably have it. Found the shelves already stripped from 2 months of drought panic buying. Found something else in the stockroom, too. Something that got in and wasn't planning on leaving. He stopped, and something in his face told me the worst part hadn't come yet. There's a broadcast looping on what's left of the radio, he said. Government voice, recorded. Says clean water sources are now the highest priority for evacuation planning. Says anybody sitting on a working well should expect, he chose the word careful, attention. From authorities. And from anybody else who's heard the same broadcast. I looked past him at my own well, running the same as it had for 88 years while the whole county turned to dust and worse around it, and I understood that surviving the infected might not even be the hardest part of what was coming. Surviving everybody else who was thirsty might be. Denny woke around 11, and when I told him what Earl had said, something sharpened underneath the grief still sitting on his face. We should fortify, he said. Fences already good on the west side, from Dad's cattle days. East side's open, though. Anybody could walk right up from the buffered place. Show me, Earl said, and the 3 of us walked the fence line together, Earl running his hand along the chain link the way he used to run it along pipe, testing for the give that meant weakness. We spent the next hour turning my property into something closer to a fort than a home. Denny found chain and a padlock in the garage and secured the east gate. Earl went through my dad's old tools and rigged a bar for the back door, a length of pipe wedged into brackets he screwed into the frame in 6 minutes flat, moving like a much younger man, like the emergency had reached back through the decades and pulled some sharper version of him up to the surface. We heard gunfire around 1, a mile off toward the middle of town. 3 shots, a pause, 2 more, then nothing. We all stood still and listened like the silence after it was going to tell us something. I guess it did. It meant somebody out there had a working gun and was willing to use it and hadn't died doing so, which in Cedar Hollow that day made them either very lucky or very dangerous, and I didn't know which one I was hoping for. It was 2:15 when my sister finally called back. Marcus. Denise's voice came through broken, half static, Caleb crying somewhere behind her, that specific worn-out crying kids do when they've been scared too long and their body just keeps doing it out of habit. We're at the Motel 6 off the highway. Roy's, something bit him before we got the door shut, and Marcus, he's got fever already. It's only been 3 hours and he's got fever, and I don't know what happens next. I don't know what happens to him. Come here, I said. Cedar Hollow's 40 minutes. Avoid Main Street, avoid downtown. Come around by the old grain silo road. She didn't answer right away. In that pause I heard something I'll never be able to unhear. Roy's voice behind her, low and wrong, saying her name in a way that didn't sound like a man asking for help. It sounded like him testing the shape of the word in a mouth that wasn't working right anymore. Then Denise screamed. Not a scared scream. A decision scream, the kind you make when your body understands, before your mind catches up, that the next 3 seconds are going to define the rest of your life. Denise. I was shouting into a phone that hadn't gone dead. It had gone quiet, this open quiet full of small sounds I couldn't identify and didn't want to, and then Caleb's voice, thin and high and right up against the phone. Uncle Marcus, Mommy said drive to your house. Mommy said the silo road. Mommy said don't stop for anybody. Uncle Marcus, is Daddy gonna be okay? Mommy's crying and Daddy's making a weird sound, and I don't. The call dropped. I sat down on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinets, head between my knees, because the room had started tilting and I thought I might be sick. Earl put a hand on my shoulder. Denny stood in the doorway with nothing to say. Get up, Earl said, not unkind, just necessary. That boy is driving toward us right now on a road with no idea what's on it. We don't have time to fall apart. We can fall apart later, once everybody's inside a locked door. Get up, Marcus. I got up. I climbed to the porch roof, you could reach it from the upstairs hallway window, and watched the silo road with Earl's old hunting binoculars. Waiting for someone you love to arrive out of a nightmare is its own kind of torture, Worse in some ways than the nightmare itself, because in the nightmare you're too busy to feel the weight of it. In the waiting, you have nothing to do but feel every second stack up on your chest. At 3:40, I saw dust on the silo road. Denise's minivan, moving too fast for the ruts, fishtailing, correcting, coming on. What I didn't see until it closed another quarter mile. 3 figures cutting across the scrub at an angle that would meet the road right where it narrows down to barely 1 lane between 2 drainage cuts. They're coming. I was already halfway to the truck when Earl caught my arm. You go alone, you're 1 gun against 3 of them and a moving vehicle besides. Denny drives, you shoot, I hold the house. Go now. Denny drove that truck down the silo road like the devil was in the bed behind us. And up ahead Denise's van hit the narrow stretch the exact same moment those 3 figures broke out of the brush, not 40 feet in front of her. She didn't slow down. She put her foot down and the van hit the first one square on, sent it up and over the hood in a way that's still in my head, and the van fishtailed hard from the impact, but she held the wheel like her whole life had been leading to that one skill. The other 2 lunged for the sides as she passed, one of them getting a hand on the mirror before the momentum tore it loose and sent the creature spinning into the ditch. We came up on the third, still trying to drag itself back onto legs that didn't look like they wanted to hold weight anymore. I put it down from 12 feet out the window, 1 shot, and Denny drove us straight through the gap it left. Both vehicles rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust with the sun beating down like none of this was anything unusual. Denise got out shaking so hard she could barely stand, and I caught her before her knees gave. Behind her, Caleb unbuckled his booster seat with small trembling hands, 7 years old and somehow not crying anymore, just quiet, staring straight ahead like he'd used up every drop of fear his body could produce. I looked into the back of the van and understood the thing Denise hadn't said on the phone. Roy wasn't in it. She'd left him. Same as Denny left Sherry. The same choice, being made in houses and cars and motel rooms across Cedar Hollow that day. The person you loved, or the person still breathing next to you who needed you alive long enough to keep loving them at all. I left him, she said into my shoulder, her voice cracking apart on every word. He was still saying my name when I locked the door, Marcus. He knew my name. He was still him enough to know my name, and I locked the door anyway. I didn't tell her it was okay. I just held on to the fact that she was warm and breathing in my arms, while the sun kept beating down on a road littered with things that used to be neighbors. We got back a little after 4:30. Earl chained the gate shut behind us the second both vehicles were inside the fence line, hands moving fast despite his age, like a man closing a vault he knew people were already lining up outside of. Caleb didn't say much that first hour. He sat at the kitchen table with an old coloring book, working the same dinosaur page over and over, not moving to the next one, just going over the same lines in different colors until the paper started to tear a little under the crayon. Nobody stopped him. I think we all understood that whatever the repetition was doing for him, none of us had the right to take it away just because it was strange to watch. Denise wouldn't eat. I put a plate of canned chili in front of her and she stared at it like the concept of food belonged to a version of the world that didn't exist anymore. Earl sat across from her and told her, quiet and steady, that grief could wait until tomorrow, that today the only job was staying alive, and staying alive required calories whether her heart had room for them or not. She ate about half the bowl. Some days that's a victory, and you let it be one. That night we set watches. Earl took first shift, I took second, Denny took the dead hours before dawn, since he'd already proven he could function on no sleep at all. Denise slept in my old room with Caleb curled against her side. Sometime after midnight, unable to sleep even though it wasn't my watch, I found Denny sitting alone against the well, rifle across his knees, staring up at a sky drowning in stars, the kind of sky you only get once every light for 60 miles has gone dark. You ever think about Sherry's garden? He said, before I'd even sat down. Tomato plants out back. She worked on him all spring, even with the drought, hauling water out there by hand every evening when the county said not to waste it. I used to tell her she was being foolish. She said something's gotta still be alive and growing, or what's the point of surviving at all? He turned the rifle over in his hands. She was right. I never told her that while she was breathing. Told her after, standing over what was left of her. when it didn't mean nothing to her no more. I put a hand on his shoulder and we sat there until the sun came up. That, more than the shooting or the running, is when I really understood what this was doing to all of us underneath the surviving part. It wasn't just about staying alive. It was every unsaid thing stacking up with nowhere left to go. Around 2 the next morning, Earl knocked soft on my door. "Come look at this." We stood on the porch roof and looked toward the county road, and in the dark, under a sky full of more stars than Cedar Hollow ever saw with its streetlights working, there were headlights. 3 sets, maybe 4, moving slow and steady, spaced out like a convoy that had rehearsed this. "They're not driving like people running from something," Earl said. "They're driving like people going somewhere on purpose." None of us slept the rest of that night, watch or no watch. We gathered on the porch as the hours ticked past, watching those headlights close and then stop, half a mile off, engines idling in the dark, like whoever was in them was doing exactly what we were doing. Watching, waiting, calculating. At 5:50, just as the eastern sky started to bruise gray at the edges, one vehicle broke off and rolled slow toward my gate, headlights off, running on the little pre-dawn light there was. A big truck, lifted, the kind of rig built for hauling cattle or hauling trouble, and mounted in the bed, silhouetted against the coming light, the unmistakable shape of more than one person standing, and more than one gun. Earl's hand found my shoulder, and this time his voice had lost the steady calm I'd been leaning on for almost 24 hours. "Whatever's about to happen at that road, whatever they say, whatever they offer, you remember this well is the only reason your family survived 100 years of this land trying to kill them. Don't you give it up easy. Don't you give it up at all." The truck stopped 40 yards from my gate, engine idling low, and a man's voice came through a bullhorn, cutting clean through the gray quiet in a way that made Caleb, standing behind us in the doorway with his mother's hands tight on his shoulders, go very still. "Whitfield Place. We know you got water in there. We just want to talk." I stepped up to the gate myself. Whatever was about to happen, I wasn't going to let it happen with me hiding behind a fence while the people I loved stood exposed in a doorway. Real fear doesn't go away just because you decide to be brave. It just moves over and lets you stand next to it. Earl grabbed my sleeve. "Don't open that gate. Talk through it. You don't owe them an open one just 'cause they got a bullhorn." "Who's asking?" I called out. A pause, then the voice again, tired underneath it. "Name's Coach Terrell Vance. Used to coach ball over at the high school. I got 9 people in these trucks, Whitfield. 9 people and about 4 gallons of water left between all of us. We been driving since midnight looking for anybody with a working well left in this county. We heard it might be you." Everybody in Cedar Hollow knew Coach Vance. 22 years coaching football, half the grown men in this county had run drills for him as boys, Denny Ruiz included, standing right there at my fence with a rifle in his hands. "Coach V." Denny called out before I could stop him. "That you out there? Denny Ruiz." Lord, I'm glad to hear a voice I know. I looked at Denny. Denny looked at me. This was about to get complicated, because now it wasn't just a stranger with a gun asking for water. It was somebody's coach, somebody's memory of being 15 and scared of nothing, standing 40 yards away with 8 other desperate people and empty jugs, and no amount of caution was going to make it simple to look that man in the eye and say no. "We got kids in these trucks," Vance called. "Little ones. We aren't here to take nothing by force, Whitfield. I swear that on everything I got left. We're here to ask. Man to man. You let us fill what we got, we go on our way. Don't even have to come inside that fence if you don't want us to." Earl leaned in close. That's exactly what a smart man would say whether he means it or not. Don't you forget that, either. I stood at my own gate, sun coming up hot and orange behind those idling trucks, my sister and her boy in the doorway, Denny's rifle aimed at a man who used to teach him to run routes on a football field, and the full weight of the first real decision of this whole disaster, mine and only mine to make, settled between my collarbones like something physical. "I'm gonna need a minute," I called out. I pulled Denny aside, out of earshot. "Can we trust him?" He didn't answer right away, which told me something on its own, Denny wasn't usually a man who needed time to think before he talked. Coach Vance never lied to a kid in his life, that I know of, he said finally. But that was before. I don't know what 9 people with 4 gallons of water and kids in the truck turns a good man into. I don't think anybody knows that about themselves till they're standing in it. I walked back to the gate. Here's what we're gonna do. You bring your trucks up slow, engines off, weapons stay in the truck beds. 2 of you come to the gate at a time to fill jugs. Nobody comes inside this fence. Nobody. You get your water, you go on your way, and coach, I mean that with respect, but I mean it all the way. A long pause. Long enough that Earl's grip tightened on his rifle. Then Vance's voice again, quieter, close enough now he didn't need the bullhorn. That's more than fair, son. More than I expected, honestly. 2 at a time, no weapons. We'll do it exactly how you say. For the next hour, 2 at a time, the survivors from Vance's convoy came to my gate and I passed jugs through the chain link while Earl worked the hand pump behind me. 4 gallons became 40. Vance himself, 63, a shotgun scar on his forearm he didn't explain and I didn't ask about. Priscilla Doone, who ran the daycare on 5th Street, for children under 10 silent in the truck bed behind her in that same worn-out way Caleb had gone silent. A young man from the gas station register, Josh still clipped to his shirt like some part of him was still clocked in for a shift that had ended 2 days and 1 apocalypse ago. And a man near the back of the second truck who never got out. Knees pulled to his chest, staring at nothing. That's Harlan Boyd, Vance said, when I asked. Bit 2 nights ago. Just a scrape, forearm, we cleaned it good. He hasn't turned. Fever came and went. We've been watching him close, but far as we can tell, whatever that thing carries, Harlan might have beat it. I didn't know, standing there, whether that was even possible. Nobody had told us whether a bite was always a death sentence or whether some bodies fought it off. I looked at Harlan Boyd, hollowed out and quiet, and thought about what it must be like to be the one person a whole group is watching, every hour, waiting to see if you're about to become the thing that kills them all. When the jugs were full, Vance stood at the gate one more time. I owe you, son. Whatever this world turns into from here, I owe you, and I don't forget debts like that. He looked back down the county road. There's supposed to be a shelter setting up at the fairgrounds outside Abilene. National Guard, they're saying. Fences, food, real medical. You ought to think about it too, Whitfield. A well's a blessing, but it's also a target. Every day you sit on it, more people are gonna come asking, and not all of them are gonna ask as nice as I did. I watched his convoy pull away until the trucks were just shapes and then nothing against the horizon. He ain't wrong, Earl said, once they'd gone. About it being a target. I know. What do you want to do about that? I looked back at the house. Denise in the doorway with Caleb, Denny with his rifle finally lowered all the way for the first time in a lifetime, the well sitting behind all of it, patient, ancient, the one true thing that hadn't changed while everything else came apart in 2 days. I don't know yet. I told him, and it was the truest answer I had. But I know we can't just sit here waiting for the next truck to be less polite than Vance was. 3 days passed, and I want to say they were quiet, but quiet isn't quite right. It was more like the whole world had inhaled and was holding it, waiting to see who moved first. We fell into something like a routine. Earl ran the well and the pump like he'd been doing it his whole life. Denny walked the fence line twice a day, checking every panel for weak spots, muttering to himself in a way that was less paranoia and more needing something to do with his hands that wasn't grief. Denise taught Caleb his times tables at 9 sharp every morning, because if the world was ending, she still wasn't going to let her son fall behind in 4th grade math. Kids need normal, she told me. Even fake normal. Especially fake normal. I kept watch mostly, up on the porch roof with the binoculars, counting infected drifting past on the county road, sometimes alone, sometimes in 2s and 3s, always moving with that same aimless hunger. More than once I watched one stop dead at the sound of the hand pump working, head turning slow toward the sound of water moving somewhere close, before drifting off again once the pumping stopped. They could still hear it. Still want it. Whatever was left when everything else burned away, That thirst was the last light still on in the house. On the second morning of that quiet stretch, Earl came back from checking the far pasture fence with his face gone pale under all that sun-weathered skin. "There's a trench dug out there. Fresh. Somebody's been surveying our property line in the dark, Marcus, and they did it careful, so the dogs wouldn't bark, the fence wouldn't rattle." He met my eyes. "I don't think those riders were the whole plan. I think that was a probe." The word sat in my chest the rest of the day. A probe. Like we were a wall somebody was testing for the soft spot before the real weight came down. The riders hit us on the fourth morning. 6 of them on horseback, coming up slow from the buffered side. Not desperate townsfolk, but armed, organized, matching dark clothing, moving in formation the way men move when they've done this exact thing more than once before. They stopped at the tree-line, the same spot that first woman had stood, and one of them raised a rifle scope instead of a bullhorn, aimed straight at my porch roof. "Get down," Earl hissed, yanking me back, and a single shot cracked out and took a clean chip out of the shingle right where my head had been. "That wasn't a warning shot," Earl said, already moving for the stairs. "That was a miss. Denise got Caleb down into the root cellar my father built back in the 80s. Denny opened up on movement in the brush from the fence line. 3 of them came over the east fence on foot while the rest kept us pinned from the tree-line. And I have never in my life felt what I felt watching strangers with guns come over my dead father's fence toward the well 4 generations of my family had protected on this ground. It wasn't just fear. It was something older, something that lives down in the base of a person, the same thing that made that first woman stand at my tree-line saying one word over and over. Some things you protect without deciding to. Your body decides for you. I put one down before he made 15 feet past the fence. Earl got another, clean and calm, this 71-year-old man who used to teach me to bait a hook moving through gunfire like he'd trained for it his whole life and never had the occasion to show it. The third made it almost to the well before Denny caught him from the side. What happened after that, I'm not going to walk through in detail, except to say Denny Ruiz, who'd lost his wife days earlier and carried it like a stone in his chest every hour since, found a place in himself that day none of us had seen yet, and it ended with that third man not moving anymore either, and Denny standing over him breathing hard, rifle shaking in his hands. The ones at the tree-line pulled back once they'd lost 3 men in under 2 minutes. Cowardice or strategy, I couldn't tell you, and I don't think it matters which. They rode off north. We stood in that yard afterward. Even Caleb, who'd come up from the cellar the second the shooting stopped despite his mother's arms trying to hold him down, and looked at 3 strangers lying in the dirt of a yard that had belonged to my family for 88 years, and nobody said anything for a long time. We buried them past the east fence the next morning. We didn't know their names. I said a few words anyway, mostly because Denise asked me to, mostly because Caleb was watching and she wanted him to see that even now, even in this, there was a way to be a person about death instead of just a number in a ditch. 2 days after that, Priscilla Doone came back. Alone, on foot, 4 days after Vance's convoy had first passed through, walking up that county road in the heat with an empty gallon jug in each hand, her daycare cardigan still buttoned proper despite everything, like some habits are the last thing a person's willing to let the end of the world take from them. The shelter at the fairgrounds had turned her away, she said. Not for good. Processing delays, overcrowding, guard triage on who got in first by injury and age. But somebody had volunteered to walk back out for the group still waiting outside the fence, and nobody else was willing to make the trip alone. I filled her jugs myself. Didn't think twice about the 2-person rule this time, just opened the gate a crack and let her stand close while Earl worked the pump. When she thanked me, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on her face, I understood what Earl had been trying to tell me all along. The gate wasn't a wall. It was a decision, made new every time, and some decisions cost you nothing at all except the willingness to make them. Vance radioed us the week after, on a borrowed National Guard frequency. Harlan Boyd never turned. Walking around the fairground shelter plane as day, bite healed up to a scar. Whatever the outbreak carried, his body beat it clean. I don't know what that means for the rest of this, whether more people are like Harlan than we think, whether something in some of us fights back, but I think about it most nights. It means hope was never as dead as this county looked from the outside. A week later, Real news came over Earl's hand crank radio, not looping static. The fairground shelter outside Abilene was holding. National Guard had a real perimeter up, real medical, and they were broadcasting coordinates for anyone still out in the county to make their way there. Denise wanted to go immediately, for Caleb's sake. I understood that completely. I stayed. I'd become the kind of man Earl described that first morning, the kind who opens the gate, and I couldn't do that from inside a fairground fence 40 minutes away. If people were still out there, thirsty, scared, dying slow the way this whole county had been dying slow long before anything with teeth showed up, somebody needed to stand at this gate deciding, every day, who got to drink and who this family was willing to risk everything for. Denise and Caleb left with a National Guard escort 11 days after the attack. Watching that van pull away down the same silo road it had come flying up 2 weeks before was its own kind of hard, quieter than anything before it. Just Denise's hand flat against the window glass and Caleb's face turned back to watch the house until the dust swallowed it whole. Denny stayed. Earl stayed. We reinforced the east fence until it could have held back a stampede, and we kept the well running, and we kept deciding, every week, who got to come to that gate and fill their jugs and go on their way. It's been 4 months now. The well still runs. People still come, less often, but they come, walking sometimes for miles once their trucks run dry, and every time I see a figure on that county road, I feel the same weight settle between my collarbones I felt the morning Vance's convoy rolled up out of the dawn light, asking to talk. Some nights, when it's quiet, when Denny's on watch and Earl's asleep, and the whole county is holding its breath the way it does every night now, I walk out to the well alone and stand there in the dark. I think about that first woman, the one who stood at my tree-lean with her lips cracked open and just one word left in her, and how thirst was the last thing to leave her, the last human thing she was carrying even after everything else had gone. I put my hand on the cold stone lip of a well my great-grandfather dug by hand in 1938, water still running clean underneath 88 years of Texas drought and depression, and now whatever this is, and I understand something I don't think I could have understood any other way. We are all just thirsty things, standing at fences in the dark, hoping somebody on the other side decides we're worth letting in. I will always keep the gate. Find me at the well. Winter doesn't come easy to a drought. That's something nobody tells you until you've lived through one. You'd think the heat breaking would feel like relief, and for about a week in November it did. Cool mornings, frost on the truck windshield, the first real cold Cedar Hollow had seen in over a year. Then the wind started, and it didn't stop, and I learned that a dust storm doesn't care whether it's 90 degrees or 38. It just needs dry ground and something to pick it up with. We got both. The well kept running. That's the first thing I want you to know, because for a long stretch that winter it felt like the only thing in the world that still did what it was supposed to do. 5 months since that first knock on my door, and my hands didn't shake anymore when I worked the pump. That should have scared me more than it did. You get used to things. That's the part nobody warns you about either. Not that the world ends, but that you keep living in it anyway, and eventually the ending starts to feel like Tuesday. Denny wasn't doing well. I want to say that plain, because for a long time I didn't say it at all, not even to myself. He'd started keeping a bottle out in the equipment shed, the one place on the property he figured nobody checked, and I found it in October stacked behind a coil of rusted fence wire, half empty, and I didn't say anything to him about it. I told myself that was kindness. Looking back, I think it was cowardice wearing kindness's clothes. A man doesn't need somebody policing his grief, but he does need somebody willing to say her name out loud with him once in a while, and I hadn't done that in weeks. I'd gotten too busy being the man who kept the gate to remember I was also supposed to be his friend. Earl's heart had started doing something none of us liked. He never complained. Earl Bannister complaining about his own body would have been like the well complaining about being dug. But I caught him twice that fall sitting down hard on an overturned bucket out by the pump, pressing the heel of his hand flat against his chest and breathing slow through his nose until whatever it was passed. The second time, I asked him straight out if he was all right, and he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before, something almost apologetic. I'm 71 years old, Marcus, and I've been running on adrenaline and canned chili since July, he said. Something in here's gonna give eventually. I just need it to hold a little longer than I need it to. I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't, some nights. What I did know, by the middle of November, was that word about the Whitfield well had traveled further than Cedar Hollow's own dying edges. It had gotten out past the county line, past the wreckage of the towns around us, and it had reached the kind of people Coach Vance's warning had been trying to prepare me for, people for whom asking nice at a gate wasn't even a consideration. His name, we'd learn later, was Royce Kettering, and the first anyone at the Whitfield place heard of him was on a Tuesday afternoon in the third week of November, when a woman walked up the county road alone, no truck, no horse, just walking the way. Priscilla Doone had walked back in August, except this woman wasn't asking for water. She stopped 40 yards out, well short of my gate, and called out that she had a message and nothing else. No weapon, and would I let her say it from where she stood? I let her. Denny stood at the fence with his rifle low but ready, the way he'd learned to hold it that summer, and Earl watched from the porch roof with the binoculars, and I stood at the gate and listened to a thin, tired-looking woman in her 40s tell me that a man named Kettering controlled most of what used to be 3 counties north and west of us, that he'd built what she called a real operation, out of a grain co-op and a fleet of trucks that still ran on diesel he'd hoarded before the collapse. And that he'd heard, same as everybody eventually heard, about a well outside Cedar Hollow that had never once gone dry. He doesn't want to fight you for it, she said. He wants to buy it. Or, not buy it exactly. He wants you to work for him. Says a well like that's worth more producing steady for an operation than sitting behind one family's fence feeding whoever wanders up. Says he can offer protection nobody else in this whole part of the state can offer. Fuel. Food stores. Real medicine, not fairground rationing. She hesitated, and something in her face told me she hadn't wanted to say the next part. Says if you say no, he'll understand. But he also said to tell you he doesn't ask a second time the same way he asks the first. I asked her what that meant. She looked at me like the answer should have been obvious, and maybe it was, and I just didn't want to hear it said. It means the first ask is a woman walking up a road with no gun, she said. I don't know what the second one looks like. I've never seen it. I've only heard the men who work for him talk about the ones who said no. I told her I needed time to think it through. She nodded like she'd expected exactly that answer, and she told me Kettering would send someone back in a week for my decision, and then she turned and walked back down the county road the same way she'd come, and I watched her go until she was just a shape and then nothing, the same way I'd watched Vance's trucks disappear 5 months before, except this time nothing about it felt like relief. Earl came down off the roof with his face set in a way I recognized. It was the look he'd had the morning he told me about the government broadcast, the one that meant he'd already done the math on something and didn't like the answer. A man who sends an unarmed woman to make his first offer isn't a fool, he said. He's patient. Patient men who build operations out of grain co-ops in the middle of an apocalypse are the most dangerous kind there is, because they're not reacting to the end of the world, Marcus. They're capitalizing on it. Denny hadn't said a word through any of it. When he finally did, his voice had an edge I hadn't heard from him since the morning of the riders. We already fought off 6 of somebody's men once, he said. We can fight off whatever this Kettering sends. 6 men on horseback caught us by surprise in the dark, Earl said. You're talking about a man who's got fuel, trucks, and enough people working under him that he can afford to send a message before he sends a fight. That's not the same math, son, and I need you to understand that before you start thinking it is. I didn't sleep well that week. I want to say that plain, the way I said it about Denny's bottle, because I think it matters that you understand the decision that was coming wasn't made calm and clear-headed. It was made by a tired man who hadn't slept right in 5 months, standing at a well that had become the center of gravity for every dangerous thing left in this part of Texas, trying to figure out how to protect the 2 people he had left without becoming the kind of man who'd trade them for safety. The second visit came 4 days early, not 7, which I took as its own kind of message. This time it wasn't a lone woman on foot. It was 3 trucks, better kept than Vance's convoy had been, moving with the same deliberate, rehearsed pacing Earl had clocked in the riders before they attacked, and they stopped at the same distance the woman had stopped at, engines idling, nobody stepping out. A man's voice came through a truck-mounted speaker, and I want you to understand the difference between that voice and Coach Vance's, because it's a difference that stayed with me. Vance's voice, even amplified and tired and pleading, had something human cracking through the edges of it. This voice didn't crack. It was smooth the way a salesman's voice is smooth, the way a man talks when he's said the exact same words to a dozen other people standing at a dozen other gates, and it worked every time, or worked often enough that he'd never bother changing it. "Marcus Whitfield," the voice said. "My name's Royce Kettering. I believe my associate delivered my offer last week." "She did," I called back. "And what did you decide?" I looked at Earl. I looked at Denny. Neither of them said anything, because we'd already had this conversation 3 times over the 4 days since the woman walked up our road, and we'd landed, all 3 of us, in the same place, even if none of us felt good about landing there. "We decided no," I called out. "Well stays ours. We'll keep doing what we've been doing. Filling jugs for anybody who asks polite and doesn't come armed. That's the offer we're making back to you, same as we made it to everybody else." There was a pause long enough that I could hear the wind picking up dust off the county road, carrying it in a thin brown curtain across the space between us. "I respect a man who knows his own mind," Kettering's voice said finally, and there was something underneath the smoothness now, something that had been waiting the whole time to come out. "I do want you to understand something though, Whitfield, and I want you to hear it clear, because I'm not gonna repeat myself on this part. I've got 400 people depending on me for water and food and safety across 3 counties. 400 people, Whitfield. You've got a well, a fence, and 2 men standing next to you. I am not asking you this because I need your permission. I'm asking you because I'd rather this go easy than hard, and I am giving you the courtesy of choosing which one it's gonna be. That courtesy has a shelf life. You understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand you're threatening me," I called back, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, the same way it had with Denny on the phone back in July, the same way it had with Vance at this exact gate. "I'm not threatening you," Kettering said. "I'm describing math. There's a difference, same as your friend on the roof up there probably already explained to you." A pause, and I understood then that he knew about Earl, knew probably more about all 3 of us than we knew about him, which was its own kind of threat dressed up as information. "You've got until the first hard freeze to change your mind. After that, I stop asking." The trucks pulled away, unhurried, and I stood at the gate a long time after the dust from them had settled, thinking about a 400-person operation and a man who talked about violence the way other men talk about weather, and I understood, standing there, that Coach Vance's warning back in July had been true in a way I hadn't fully let myself believe until that moment. A well was a blessing and it was a target, and I had just told the most dangerous target maker in 3 counties that I intended to keep it anyway. We spent the next 2 weeks doing everything we could think to do. Earl rigged trip wires along the weak stretches of fence using fishing line and cans of loose bolts. Nothing that would stop a truck, but plenty that would announce one coming through brush on foot in the dark. Denny and I dug a second fallback position behind the well itself, a low earthen berm we could get behind if the fence line ever failed, and I hated every hour we spent digging it, because digging it meant admitting out loud, with our hands in our backs, that the fence line failing was a real thing we now had to plan around. We also, for the first time since July, started talking seriously about whether staying was still the right call. "There's still coordinates for the fairground shelter," Denny said one evening, the 3 of us sitting around the kitchen table with a lantern between us because we'd started rationing the generator fuel too. "Guards holding it. Real perimeter. We could load what we need in the truck and be there in under an hour. And leave the well running for Kettering to walk right into," Earl said. "Better than leaving it running for Kettering to walk right into with us standing in front of it." It was the closest the 3 of us ever came to a real argument, and I remember sitting there in the lantern light, watching 2 men I trusted more than almost anybody left alive pull in opposite directions, and understanding that whatever I decided next was going to cost something either way. That's the thing about the world after it ends. It doesn't stop asking you to make decisions just because the decisions got harder. If anything, it asks more of you, more often, with less time to think them through. I thought about my father that week, more than I had since the whole thing started. He wasn't a man who talked much about the well, not directly, but I remembered him telling me once, years before he died, that a man doesn't get to choose what he inherits, only what he does with it once it's his. I'd always thought he meant the house, or the land, or maybe just the stubborn Whitfield temperament that had apparently skipped no generation since 1938. Sitting at that kitchen table in November, watching the lantern light flicker against Earl's tired face and Denny's angry one, I understood he might have meant something bigger than any of that, and that I was living inside the meaning of it whether I'd chosen to or not. "We stay," I said, finally. "I know what that costs if it goes wrong. But if we run, every well like this one becomes Kettering's the second the family holding it gets scared enough to leave, and that's not a world I want Caleb growing up into, even from inside a fairground fence. We stay, and we get ready, and if Kettering wants this well bad enough to come take it, he's gonna have to spend more than he wants to spend to get it." Denny didn't look happy about it. But he nodded, and that was enough. The first hard freeze came on December 3rd, and I remember waking that morning to a stillness that felt different from every other morning since July. No wind, no dust, just cold clean air and frost thick on every blade of dead grass in the yard, and a silence so complete I could hear the well pump's metal ticking as it cooled overnight. I stood on the porch a long time that morning, breath fogging in front of me, waiting to see what a deadline looked like when it finally arrived. Nothing came that day. Nothing came the day after either, and by the third day I'd started to let myself hope that maybe Kettering had found an easier well somewhere else, some family less stubborn than mine, and that the math he'd talked about had simply worked out in somebody else's favor instead. He came on the fifth night, and he didn't send a woman walking up the road first, and he didn't send 3 trucks idling politely at a distance. He came the way Earl had warned me a patient, capitalizing man eventually comes. All at once, in the dark, with more than enough force that the outcome was supposed to already be decided before the first shot ever got fired. I counted 6 trucks by their engine sound alone before I ever saw a headlight, coming from 2 directions at once, which told me Kettering had learned something from watching how the riders failed against us back in August. He wasn't going to give us one direction to defend. Denny had the tripwire cans start rattling out past the east fence within minutes, and Earl was already moving for the porch roof with a speed that scared me more than the trucks did, because it meant his body was finding reserves it had no business having at 71, and reserves like that always come from somewhere, and they always get paid back eventually. "Marcus." Denise's voice came through the walkie-talkie Earl had rigged between the house and the root cellar back in August, and I want you to understand that Denise wasn't there that December. She was still 40 minutes away at the fairground shelter with Caleb, but I'd insisted, after the riders, that we keep a radio link open between our 2 places whenever we could manage the batteries, just so somebody outside our fence would know, in real time, if the worst finally happened here. It was her voice on the other end that night, thin and far away and trying too hard to sound calm. "Marcus, are you there? Is it starting? Over." "It's starting," I said into the radio, and I hated how flat my own voice sounded saying it. "Get Caleb somewhere solid. I'll call you when it's over. Whenever that is. I want to walk you through what happened next the way it actually happened, not smoothed over, because I think the smoothing over is its own kind of lie, and I've told enough of those already just getting through each day since July. The first truck came through the east fence at a dead run, not slowing for the gate at all, just putting the grill straight through chain link Denny had reinforced as well as 3 men with hand tools could reinforce it, which turned out to be nowhere near well enough. The fence gave the way paper gives, and the truck barreled 15 feet into the yard before Denny put 3 rounds into the windshield, and it swerved hard into the equipment shed, taking out a corner of it in a crash of splintering wood that I felt in my chest more than heard. 2 men came out of the wreck already firing, and I want to tell you I remember every second of the next few minutes clearly, but the truth is it comes back to me now in pieces, disconnected like a reel of film somebody cut apart and only handed me half of. I remember muzzle flash from the treeline where a second group had come up on foot exactly like the riders had in August, exactly like Earl had warned they might, hitting us from 2 directions the way a patient man plans to. I remember Earl firing from the roof, steady, controlled, the same way he'd fired in August, except this time there were more targets than there'd been riders, and I remember, at some point in those first minutes, hearing him cry out, short and sharp, and not being able to go check on him because there were men coming through my fence and I had a shotgun in my hands and a decision to make about who I was in that exact moment. The same decision I'd been making over and over since a woman with a bite mark said one word to me on my porch in July. I don't know how long the fighting lasted. Denny would tell me later he thought it was almost 20 minutes, though it felt to both of us more like two. I remember the cold most of all, underneath everything else. How strange it was to be shaking from adrenaline and shaking from 30-degree air at the same time, how my breath kept fogging out in front of the shotgun barrel every time I exhaled. A small white cloud lit up gray-orange by somebody's headlights every time it happened, like my own body was giving away my position with every breath I took. At some point, I still don't know exactly when, the reel of film cutting apart worse in this stretch than anywhere else. I found myself pressed flat against the well itself, the actual stone lip my great-grandfather had set by hand, using it for cover the way you'd use a boulder or a fallen tree, and I remember thinking, in the strange sideways way your mind goes wandering even in the middle of the worst of it, that there was something almost unbearable about that. Using the well for cover. Using the one true thing in 60 miles that had never done anything but give. Propping my body against it while I did the only thing I could do to keep it mine. 2 men came around the east side of the shed while I was still braced there, moving low, and I put both barrels into the first one before he'd gotten a clean shot off, and the second one turned to run and Denny caught him from the fence line, and I want to tell you it felt like something other than what it was, but it didn't. It felt exactly like what it was. 2 more men who used to be somebody's son, somebody's husband, lying still in the frost-hard dirt of a yard that had belonged to my family for 88 years. And I didn't have room in me that night to grieve them the way I understood. Some distant clinical part of my brain understood that they probably deserved grieving. I just had room to keep breathing and keep the shotgun loaded and wait for the next sound out of the dark. What I know for certain is that when it stopped, when the trucks that were still drivable pulled back through the broken fence and disappeared down the county road the way the riders had disappeared north 5 months before, we had lost the equipment shed, we had lost most of the east fence. And Earl Bannister had taken a round through the meat of his left shoulder, high enough to miss anything that would have killed him outright, but low enough that it had shattered something in the joint that the 2 of us, working by flashlight in my kitchen with a first aid kit meant for scraped knees and fishing hooks, had no real way to fix. Denny didn't say a word the whole time we worked on Earl. He sat at the far end of the kitchen table with his rifle still across his knees, staring at his own hands like they belonged to somebody else. And it was only after Earl was patched and finally asleep, sometime past 3 in the morning, that Denny spoke at all. "That's twice now," he said, quiet, not looking at me. "Twice I've had to be the kind of man who does that. I keep thinking it's supposed to get easier the second time. It doesn't. It just gets quieter afterward. That's the only difference I can find." I didn't have anything to tell him that would have made it smaller than it was. So I didn't try. I just sat with him at that table until the sun came up gray over a yard littered with things that used to be somebody, the same way it had come up gray over a yard littered with things that used to be somebody back in August, and I understood that this was a debt the 2 of us were going to keep paying, piece by piece, for as long as the well kept being worth defending. "I'm all right," he kept saying, teeth gritted, sweat standing out on his forehead despite the cold, while I packed gauze against a wound that needed a surgeon and a hospital neither of which existed anywhere I could reach that night. "I'm all right, Marcus. Quit looking at me like that." I wasn't sure I believed him, and I don't think he believed himself either, but there wasn't another option in front of us except to believe it together and keep moving, so that's what we did. Kettering didn't come back the next night, or the night after that. I understand now, thinking back on it, that the attack had never been meant to take the well outright. It had been meant to show us what taking it would look like, to remind us that the math he'd described at the gate in November was still the math, and that our little victory in the dark had cost us a shed, a fence line, and Earl's shoulder, while costing him 1 truck and however many men he could afford to lose out of 400. Patient men who capitalize on the end of the world don't need to win every fight. They just need to keep proving they can afford to lose the ones they don't. Denny changed after that night. In a way I don't think either of us fully understood until weeks later. He stopped drinking, which should have been good news and mostly was, except it came alongside something harder underneath it, a kind of grim, unblinking focus that scared me a little, the way watching a man decide something irreversible always scares you a little. He spent every spare hour rebuilding the fence, better than before, with scavenged sheet metal from the ruined equipment shed welded into panels no truck was going to drive through twice. He didn't talk much while he worked. I think the work had become the thing that let him not talk, the same way Caleb's crayon had let him not cry, and I understood that well enough by then not to interrupt it. Earl's shoulder healed wrong. I want to say that plainly too. Without a real surgeon, without the kind of care that used to just exist in the world before all of this, the joint set stiff and crooked, and by January he'd lost most of the strength and range in that arm, enough that working the hand pump, the single job he'd carried without complaint since the second morning of all this, had become something he could only manage in short stretches before the pain and the weakness in his shoulder forced him to stop and sit on that same overturned bucket, breathing slow through his nose. He never once complained about it. What he did instead, one gray morning in January while I was helping him wrap the shoulder fresh, was tell me something I think he'd been carrying since the night of the attack and hadn't found the right moment to say. "I'm not going to be much use to you a lot longer, Marcus," he said, quiet, not looking at me, looking instead at the pump handle across the yard like it was a thing he was already grieving. "Shoulders not coming back right. Heart's not getting any younger. I need you to hear that from me now, plain, so it doesn't have to be a surprise to either of us later." I told him he was still plenty used to us, and I meant it, but I understood underneath what he was really telling me. He was telling me that the thing Cedar Hollow had asked of him, the fence lines, the pump, the fast hands rigging brackets in 6 minutes flat, the steady rifle on the porch roof, was a thing his body could only give for so much longer, and that whatever came next for the Whitfield well was going to have to be carried by people who still had the years left in them to carry it. "I need to teach you things," he said. "Pump maintenance. The valve system. How to read when the water table's dropping before it becomes an emergency instead of after. Things I know that nobody else left around here knows, because I spent 30 years learning them before any of this happened, and there wasn't exactly a manual written for what we're doing now." We spent the next month doing exactly that. Most mornings, Earl walking me through everything he understood about the well and the pump, and the whole quiet architecture of keeping water moving up out of the ground reliably, year after year, drought or no drought. I want you to know I paid closer attention during those mornings than I think I've ever paid to anything in my life, because somewhere underneath the lesson itself was a harder truth neither of us said out loud, which was that Earl was handing me the well the same way my father had handed it to me 4 years before he died, except this time I understood, watching him do it, exactly what that kind of handing over costs a man, and exactly what it means to be the one still standing there. Afterward, a man showed up at the gate the last week of January, alone, on foot, dragging one leg behind him in a way that made Denny reach for the rifle before he'd even gotten a good look at the man's face. It was near dusk, the light going that flat gray-orange it goes in winter out here, and for a second, just a second, I thought we were about to find out whether the infected had learned to walk further than they used to, whether the cold had done something to them we hadn't accounted for. He wasn't infected. He was just hurt, badly, a gash along his hairline crusted dark, and a leg that had been set wrong by somebody without the first idea how to set a leg, and he collapsed against the fence post before he ever made it close enough to call out. So it was Denny who reached him first, through the gate, dragging him the last 10 feet into the yard while I covered the tree-line in case the man's condition was somebody else's opening. His name was Foster. He'd been holding a well of his own, 40 minutes west, with his wife and his wife's brother, 3 people same as 3 of us had started out, and he told us, once we'd gotten water and something warm into him, that Kettering's people had come for them in December, the same week they'd come for us, and that Foster's well hadn't held. "They didn't even fight us proper," he said, staring at the lantern flame instead of any of our faces while he talked. The way a man talks when he's not sure he can get the words out if he has to watch somebody's reaction to them. "Wasn't like what I heard happened here. They just sat outside the fence 3 days straight, didn't fire a shot, didn't say much of anything, just sat there with more trucks than we had bullets, and on the 4th morning my wife's brother said we ought to just take the deal, and I said no, and by that evening it wasn't my decision to make anymore. Voted 2-1 against me, in my own kitchen." He laughed, short and without any humor in it at all. "They're both still there. Working the well for Kettering's operation now. Guess I wasn't cut out for it. Guess I said something I shouldn't have to one of Kettering's men on my way out, because that's how I ended up with this." He gestured at the leg, at the gash along his hairline, and didn't say anything else about it, and none of us asked him to. Earl set the leg again that night, as best a man with 1 working arm and 30 years of pipe fitting instead of medical training could manage, and Foster stayed with us 11 days while it started to knit right, and in that time he told us more about Kettering's operation than the note nailed to the fence post ever had. The grain co-op turned into something closer to a company town. Families put to work on wells and fields and fuel depots in exchange for protection and rations, a hierarchy that rewarded the families who'd come in early and squeezed the ones who'd come in late or come in scared. It wasn't slavery, not exactly, Foster was careful to say, like the distinction mattered to him more than it probably should have. It was just a kind of belonging you couldn't leave once you were in it. The way belonging to anything desperate enough eventually stops being a choice. "He'll come back for you," Foster told me, the morning before he left to try his luck making his way to the fairground shelter on a leg that still wasn't fully right. Man like that doesn't let a holdout sit this close to his territory forever. You're an example either way it goes, Marcus. Either you're the example of what happens to people who say no, or you're the example that makes every other family he's swallowed start wondering if they should have said no too. He can't afford to let you just keep existing in between those two things. I thought about that a long time after he'd gone, walking off down the county road the same direction Priscilla Doone had walked back in August, except walking away from us instead of toward, and I understood that Foster had put into plain words the thing I'd been feeling but hadn't let myself say since November. This wasn't a siege we could simply survive our way past. It was a slow, grinding pressure that was only going to keep building for as long as the well kept running, and Kettering kept needing more wells to feed whatever his operation had become. And somewhere down that road, sooner or later, there was going to have to be an ending to it, one way or the other. Denise came back to Cedar Hollow in February, and I need to tell you about that visit carefully, because it's the part of this whole story I've turned over in my head more than almost any other night since July. She'd gotten word, somehow, through the loose network of radio operators and runners that had grown up between the fairground shelter and the handful of holdouts still scattered across the county, that there'd been fighting at the Whitfield place in December. It took her 3 weeks to arrange an escort back out. The guard didn't like civilians moving unsupervised between the shelter and the county anymore. Not after Kettering's operation had started making itself known to more people than just us. But she came, with Caleb, in the back of a guard truck driven by a young soldier who didn't say much and watched the tree lean the whole time like he expected trouble, even with 4 other armed men riding along. Caleb had grown. That's a strange thing to notice in the middle of everything else, but it's what struck me hardest when I saw him climb down out of that truck. He'd grown 2 inches since August, in that specific way kids do when you're not watching closely enough, and something about it made the whole 7 months since that first knock on my door feel suddenly, physically real to me in a way the fighting and the fence building somehow hadn't. Denise hugged me a long time at the gate, and when she finally stepped back, she looked past me at the rebuilt fence line, at the burned-out corner of the equipment shed we hadn't gotten around to clearing yet, at Earl sitting on his bucket with his bad arm wrapped tight against his chest, and I watched her doing the same math Coach Vance had done back in July, the same math Earl had done, the same math I did myself every single morning I woke up and remembered where I was and what I was still holding on to. "You could still come to the shelter," she said, quiet, once Caleb had run off to find Denny, who he'd apparently missed more than either of them had let on over the radio. "Both of you. All 3 of you. Nobody would think less of you for it, Marcus. You've held this well 7 months longer than anybody thought you could." "I know," I said. "That's not a no. It's not a yes either," I told her, and I could see it landing on her the same way it always landed, a mix of pride and fear and something almost like grief. Grief for a version of her brother who might have made a different choice, an easier one, and gotten to keep him closer because of it. "Roy would have wanted you safe," she said, and her voice caught a little on his name, the way it still did sometimes, 7 months on. "Not brave. Safe." I didn't have an answer for that, not one I trusted myself to say out loud without it coming out unkind, because the truth sitting underneath my chest that whole visit was that I didn't think safe was a real thing anymore. Not the way she meant it, not the way any of us had understood the word before July. I thought there was only degrees of danger now, different flavors of exposure, and that the well, for all its risk, was at least a danger I understood the shape of, which was more than I could say for whatever waited behind a fairground fence that 400 hungry, well-armed people under a man like Kettering might eventually decide to test the same way they tested me. She stayed 2 days. Caleb and Denny rebuilt part of the shed frame together, Caleb handing up nails with the same small trembling hands that had unbuckled his booster seat back in July, Except steadier now, surer, a boy who'd watched his mother drive through a nightmare and had apparently decided somewhere along the way that being useful was its own kind of armor against being afraid. Earl taught him how to prime the pump, slow and patient despite the pain it clearly cost his shoulder to demonstrate the motion, and I stood in the kitchen doorway watching the two of them out by the well, an old man with a ruined arm and a boy who used to be obsessed with dinosaurs, and I thought that if there was anything left in this world worth protecting a well for, it was exactly that image, small and ordinary, and stubbornly alive in the middle of everything trying to convince us it couldn't be. When Denise and Caleb left the second morning, riding back out in the same guard truck, Caleb pressed something into my hand at the gate before he climbed up. A folded piece of paper from the coloring book, the dinosaur page, colored in fully now, no longer torn from being gone over the same lines 100 times, just finished, whole, every scale and spine filled in with a steady hand that hadn't been steady when he'd started it 7 months earlier. I kept that paper. I still have it. Kettering sent word again in March, though this time it wasn't trucks or a bullhorn or an unarmed woman walking up the road. It was a single sheet of paper nailed to a fence post a quarter-mile down the county road, where anybody driving past would see it, and Denny found it on his morning fence walk and brought it back to the house without a word. Just handed it to me the way you'd hand somebody something you didn't want to be holding yourself a second longer than you had to. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. It was worse than a threat, in its way, because it was patient in exactly the manner Earl had warned me about back in November. It was a simple, typed accounting. Kettering's operation had absorbed 2 more wells in the 6 weeks since the attack on us, both without a shot fired, both families choosing his offer of protection and provision over the alternative once they'd heard what had happened at the Whitfield place. The note ended with a single line, and I've thought about that line more than almost anything else that whole winter. You held. Most don't. The offer's still open, whenever holding stops being worth it to you. I showed it to Earl and Denny that evening, and none of us said much about it, because there wasn't much left to say that we hadn't already said in November. What had changed, though, what I understood reading that note by lantern light with the wind picking up outside the way it did most nights that winter, was that Kettering wasn't just a threat sitting outside our fence anymore. He was becoming the shape of the whole world outside Cedar Hollow, a slow, patient tide swallowing every well and water source in 3 counties one negotiation at a time, and the Whitfield place had become, without my ever choosing it exactly, one of the last places on his map that hadn't gone under. The same woman who'd first walked up our road back in November came again 10 days after the note, and this time I noticed something different about her before she'd said a single word. She wasn't walking like a messenger anymore. She was walking like a woman who'd decided something and hadn't told anybody yet. He doesn't know I'm here, she said, stopping at the same 40 yards she'd stopped at the first time, though this time her voice had none of the careful, rehearsed calm it had carried back in November. I'm not delivering a message. I'm asking you something, and I need you to hear it as what it is. Denny had his rifle up out of habit, but I put a hand out, low, telling him to hold, because something in the way she stood told me this wasn't a trap dressed up as a change of heart. There's more of us than you'd think, she said. Inside the operation. Families that got swallowed the way Foster's family got swallowed, working wells and fields for rations because the alternative was worse, or looked worse at the time. Kettering's not as strong as he wants people to believe. He's strong because nobody's ever told him no and made it stick. You made it stick once in December. People inside the operation talk about that more than you'd guess. People who are looking for a reason to believe there's another way to do this besides handing everything over to one man with enough trucks to make the offer sound reasonable. What are you asking me? I said. I'm asking if you'd hold this well for more than just yourselves, she said. If enough of us left at once, quiet, spread out over weeks so it doesn't look organized, would you take in families willing to work a well the way you work yours? Not for him. For each other. I don't know if it'd hold up against what he'd send once he understood what was happening. I don't know if anything holds up against that forever. But I know sitting inside his operation waiting for him to decide our worth for us isn't holding anything at all, and I'd rather go down trying to build something than keep going down slow the way we already are. I didn't answer her that day. I want you to know that, because I think it matters. I didn't say yes standing at that gate the way I'd said no to Kettering back in November, quick and certain. I told her I needed to think it through the same way I'd told Kettering's messenger I needed to think it through the first time, and she nodded like she understood exactly what that kind of answer cost a person to give honestly, and she walked back down the county road, and I stood at the gate a long time after she'd gone, turning over a decision that was bigger than anything I'd faced since the morning Coach Vance's convoy first rolled up out of the dawn asking to talk. Earl and Denny and I talked about it 3 nights running. Earl was the one who finally said the thing none of us had wanted to say first. Your daddy dug that well by hand so his family would never go without, he said. I don't think he dug it so one family could sit behind a fence deciding who's worth saving while a man like Kettering swallows up everybody outside it. I think holding the gate was always supposed to mean something bigger than just holding it shut. I don't know how this part of the story ends yet. I want to be honest with you about that. The same honesty I've tried to hold onto through all of it, even when the honest answer is just that I don't know. The well still runs. Denny's rebuilt every inch of that east fence twice over and started work on a second gate we can seal from inside if the first one ever fails. Earl still teaches me something new about the pump system most mornings, slower now, more careful with his bad shoulder, but steady, patient, the same way he's been steady and patient since the second morning of all this, since he pulled into my driveway with his hands raised and told me, easy now, it's just me. Some nights I still walk out to the well alone, same as I did back in the fall, and I put my hand on that cold stone lip, and I think about a woman with cracked lips standing in my yard saying one word into the dark, and about Coach Vance driving off into a sunrise he didn't know if he'd survive to see the end of, and about a note nailed to a fence post telling me that most people don't hold, that holding is the exception and not the rule, and I understand, standing there in the cold with my hand on stone my great-grandfather touched with his own hands 88 years before any of this, that the story of this well was never going to be a story with a clean ending. It was only ever going to be a story about how long a person can keep deciding, morning after morning, to be the kind of man who opens the gate instead of the kind who doesn't, and what that decision costs, paid out one day at a time, for as long as there's water left underneath this ground to be worth protecting. We are all just thirsty things, standing at fences in the dark, and some of us are still deciding, every single day, who gets let in. I will always keep the gate. Find me at the well. I'm not going anywhere yet.